Hi, welcome to Oceanitis TV. I'm Rocky Kistner, an environmental journalist and advisory board member of Oceanitis. We're talking to key figures about their work on polar and climate issues in Antarctica. Today, we're with Tucker Scully, who played a leading role with the U.S. State Department coordinating Arctic and Antarctic ocean policies. He served as chief U.S. negotiator on polar issues, and he led the U.S. negotiating effort for the 1991 Environmental Protocol to the Antarctic Treaty, among many other duties. Tucker, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to work for the government doing polar and oceans work.
The Department of State decided to create a new bureau in the mid-70s dealing with oceans, environment, and science, OES as it was called. And I had the opportunity to become a member of that bureau, of the oceans part of that bureau, as one of the original, if you will, original hires for that. There were major issues going on in international relations related to both the oceans and the polar regions. And one of the things that came up with respect to Antarctica was the issue of resources. The Antarctic Treaty, which goes back to 1959, which is probably one of the more amazing treaties that's been negotiated in the modern times, dealt with reserving Antarctica as a zone of peace and protecting and promoting freedom of scientific research there. Our office, which was known as the Office of Oceans at the time, but became then the Office of Oceans and Polar Affairs. So from that point on, we were responsible for Antarctic negotiations. And those negotiations, as mentioned, started in earnest on both fisheries first, and then on the issue of mineral resources in Antarctica.
Tell us about the work that you did as a negotiator for the United States. Why was that work important, and what did you actually accomplish?
1980s and 1990s in particular was a period where in international relations there was a major emphasis upon management of resources that extended across boundaries between countries. That law of the sea negotiations resulted in major extensions of offshore jurisdiction over fisheries. So there were all kinds of issues that needed to be resolved. And there was an increasing recognition that there needed to be collective management in a lot of issues if the resources really were to be protected, and there was to be a degree of equity in all of it.
So why is the Antarctic Treaty important for people around the world?
The Antarctic Treaty was done back in the late 50s. It was negotiated, it was finished in 1959. It entered into force shortly thereafter. And it was considered one of the most innovative treaties ever negotiated. I mean, it first of all created the first zone of peace in the world. It set aside an entire area of the planet and said, we are going to prohibit any military activities from taking place here, and any nuclear related activities as well. And secondly, it said we're going to devote this area entirely to science, because this is the least studied part of the planet, in the area where we have the most to learn about processes that affect the planet as a whole. So those two things, I think, were rather unique. What also happened at that time was that this treaty was negotiated at the height of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. But the US and the Soviet Union were both parties to the agreement. They both participated in the negotiation, and at the end of the day, they were able to agree. So it became a model for what could be done in terms of making real progress, even when there were divisive issues elsewhere. Now, what's bothered me recently in looking at what's going on in the Antarctic is there have been countries, so the successor to the Soviet Union, Russia, for one, and to some degree, in equal measure, probably China, who seem to be pursuing agendas that are, in a sense, alien to the Antarctic in their Antarctic activities. I mean, it would be a great tragedy if somehow that eroded and those things began to emerge in the Antarctic as well. It hasn't happened yet, but the resource issues, the way they're pursuing the resource issues, I think, is a cause for alarm.
So when did people become concerned about climate and climate impacts on this work in the Antarctic?
The interesting thing about the polar regions is that it is where the climate impacts are showing up most dramatically. So I think those of us that were involved in the polar regions began to see began to see impacts of what was clearly climate change fairly early on. Now, it was, I guess, as a result of the Rio conference in '92 that the international community began to focus on climate change. The two major impacts you began to see were, one, changes in the weather patterns, which caused changes in ocean currents. But I think that which became I think the first sort of triggers were changes in glaciers, particularly in the Antarctic Peninsula, which is the northernmost part of Antarctica, which is the area where I think there's been the most major increase in average temperature over the past few decades.
Is it surprising to you how things have changed since then? I mean, how fast and rapid the changes are in the Antarctic and polar regions?
Yes, I think those who are atmospheric scientists and glaciologists, for example, probably aren't as surprised because they could see what was happening with the rise of CO2 in the atmosphere. But certainly for those of us that worked on the region and spent time in the region, both in the Antarctic and in the Arctic, the changes have been both very, shocking in some ways.
What sort of policy responses have been effective, and what do you think needs to be done?
Impacts of climate change are showing up most dramatically in the polar regions, but it is not activities in those regions that are causing those impacts. The impacts are happening right here, where we live in the industrial, particularly in the industrialized countries. Therefore, what we really need to do is the industrialized countries and all countries need to get together and actually live up to the kinds of commitments they've made in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases. That's the only way that's going to, slowing down the unfavorable impacts of climate change in the polar regions.
Tell us how you got to know people at Oceanitis, Ron Levine, others. How did you meet them, and what were your sort of initial thoughts about what kind of work they were doing?
Ron early on understood, and this was in part looking at the Antarctic Treaty and the mechanisms under it, that one of the things you really needed to do to be able to manage activities in Antarctica effectively was to develop a sound database. And he began, as a citizen scientist, beginning to do that. He started collecting data on what he saw, and what I think everybody would agree is an indicator species in Antarctica, the Antarctic penguin populations, as a means of determining whether those populations were being impacted and then figuring out what was causing those impacts. And he developed a database and saw the need for a database that is probably the most important thing you need to have to be able to make those decisions accurately. The species that are more dependent upon colder climates, such as the Adelie penguins, have been falling in the areas he's been studying. And the penguins that are more adaptable, able to change more rapidly in terms of environmental conditions, such as the Gentoo penguins, are increasing. So he's been able to show that, first of all, that these things are happening. One of the most important things in science in Antarctica and in management is to figure out how to distinguish between natural variation and impacts that are caused by external forces, human-generated forces. And he's begun to be able to do that. I think obviously climate change is one of them, but also I think he's begun to focus on impacts of fishing activities in the vicinities of where these penguin colonies are as well. Now, obviously, what we can do about climate change can't be done in Antarctica. What can be done about fishing can be done in Antarctica. I think Ron has expanded the work of Oceanitis in a very creative way to work with actually the fishing companies themselves to work to develop buffer zones and other means of protecting penguin colonies and ensuring that their food sources are not too adversely affected.
Yeah, could you just talk a little bit about that? If you could sort of explain how fishing has been impacted and how Oceanitis has helped with that work.
The major resource in Antarctica in the marine biological realm is krill. Antarctic krill is the keystone species in Antarctica. Almost all other living species depend on krill. They're little shrimp-like crustaceans. But that was one of the reasons that the agreement originally was negotiated in the fisheries in the Antarctic, because there was, people saw krill with the estimates of the amount of krill as being a potential major contributor to world food supplies. And I think Ron has been working very creatively to ensure that they redirect the fisheries to areas which are, which will allow the penguins' foraging range to be protected, so they can continue to have a sufficient source of food for their purposes.
What are the main climate threats in the region today, and what worries you most about the future in Antarctica?
Well, I mean, I think what worries me the most about the future in Antarctica is what's being done elsewhere. It's the lack of action including in the United States, in countries that are the ones that are causing the problem. The frustration, I think, of people that have devoted their careers to Antarctica is that what you see happening there in terms of the negative impacts of rising temperatures and climate change generally is something that can't be dealt with there. The pattern that's emerged in West Antarctica of sort of collapse of glaciers begins to show itself more rapidly, which I think will happen in East Antarctica. We've got real problems with sea level rise. I mean, significant problems. And you worry for I figure I won't be around for that, but you certainly worry about your kids and your grandkids for that. And Antarctica is a place that can exemplify why it is and what it is we need to do, but to do elsewhere.
Why should people be concerned about it?
Well, if the glaciers collapse in Antarctica, most of the coastal cities of the world are going to be underwater. That's one thing. Secondly, I think Antarctica is a place we still can study on this planet a lot of the major questions that we need, that need to be answered about how this planet works. And we will lose that, we will lose the scientific value of the place if we allow, if the climate change impacts are such that scientific stations are no longer viable there.
So what do you think Antarctica will look like in the year, say, 2050? I mean, are you worried about what your kids or grandkids are going to experience?
Of course. It's pretty clear that unless there's a major change in our sort of pattern of activity, that we're going to see we're going to see an Antarctica that looks very, very different. And that if Antarctica looks very different, the rest of the world is going to look even more different, as far as I can see. And I think that we are playing with the future of our kids and grandkids, and with what we quote unquote are doing in the kind of lifestyles we're living in, and our inability to actually address the issues of greenhouse gas emissions.
So why should people support an organization like Oceanitis?
There are a variety of reasons. I mean, one of which is that it shows what individual citizens can do in terms of actually doing good science and creating and providing information about what is happening and what may happen to the world as a whole. Ron and Oceanitis have shown over the 25, 26 years or so that they have been collecting data, they've been showing what's happening. Their advocacy results from good scientific research and demonstrated scientific evidence. So I think that's one. It's evidence that is very credible in terms of what's going on with respect to climate change. Even if we were to stop greenhouse gas emissions right now, we're going to have a lot of impacts from climate change. And critters like penguins are showing how first of all, we must adapt to what's going to happen. And they're showing the kinds of, showing possible models of resilience as to how we can adapt when the inevitable impacts that are going to come do come, and hopefully showing that we can stop the worst impacts from coming altogether.
Are you optimistic about the future? I mean, from what you've witnessed so far?
Well, if I looked at my generation, I would say no. If I look at the newer generation, and I would say yes. I mean, I think if you look at some of the people that have gone to work with Ron, I mean, on the science side, with the University of Maryland and SUNY in New York, yes, it does give me hope. I think that there are people who are prepared to basically pay their dues and learn and make recommendations that are going to be important as we go forward. I think our generation has kind of failed, if you will, to address the issues properly. But I'm hoping when I look at my grandkids, I look at my son who's an oceanographer, it does give me hope.